Hello, I'm here following on from, I think, very important words from Mayor Gregor Robertson, Chief Maureen Thomas of the Tsleil-Waututh, Chief Ian Campbell of Musqueam, and Councillor Grant of Musqueam, and Chief Ian Campbell of the Squamish First Nations peoples. I wanted to give journalists here an opportunity to know more about the background of this process and why the NEB process was fatally flawed, in the words of Chief Campbell. And I wanted to share this with you from the point of view not just as a member of Parliament and not just as leader of the Green Party, but as the only member of Parliament who had intervener status in the National Energy Board process, participating right through the final argument phase. There were some others who got listed, but I worked this process. I printed out all 23,000 pages of the Kinder Morgan environmental assessment, and I went through them and I read it. And I provided final argument at the NEB in the final argument phase. And it's really important, as Mayor Robertson was just saying, that people in Ottawa hear what we know in British Columbia, which is that the National Energy Board process and its final report is not worth the paper it's written on. It brings zero value to an evidentiary process of deciding whether to approve a pipeline or not. And I've read far too much in our mainstream media that refers logically enough to, well, the National Energy Board has done all this work, why question it? And this is why, as someone who used to practice law and used to appear before the National Energy Board as a lawyer, the damage done to the National Energy Board and the damage done to Canadian environmental assessment law by Omnibus Budget Bill C-38 in spring of 2012 is, in my view, not adequately appreciated by people who've been outside of this process. So first of all, I just want to underscore, when Mayor Robertson says this was a Harper-driven NEB process, he's not speaking in a partisan way. He's not speaking politically. This is the reality of a completely corrupted process that occurred as a result of the damage done in Omnibus Budget Bill C-38. Up until C-38, the National Energy Board never did environmental assessments. That's a key point. That's not been their role as a regulator. Up until C-38, there were not artificially constructed time limits, nor was there the removal in the Environmental Assessment Act when they repealed the Environmental Assessment Act we've had since 1994 and replaced it with a completely new and inadequate law called SEA 2012. Board ruled that interveners had no right to cross-examine Kinder Morgan's experts. Now, that's a really key point because it means none of the evidence that went before the National Energy Board was tested at all. The substitution of you can have a paper exercise and send in written questions. The written questions weren't answered by the experts who prepared the reports. They were answered by Kinder Morgan's lawyers. I won't have time in this brief press conference to give you chapter and verse on what a sham of a process this was. And bear in mind, I'd appeared before the National Energy Board before. I know a quasi-judicial body when it's doing a good job, and I know when what's happened is a complete fraud. When a regulator accepts evidence that has been proven by interveners to have been deliberately falsified by the proponent and doesn't take any sanctions against falsified evidence, you've got a big problem. None of the evidence presented to Kinder Morgan, by Kinder Morgan to the NEB is worth anything. The other point I wanted to make is in response to a question asked a moment ago by David Aiken. Historically, this project provided synthetic crude to refineries in the Lower Mainland. When the process shifted, and rather than upgrade bitumen in northern Alberta to continue sending synthetic crude to refineries in Canada, there's a complete shift of process and project and economic theory when they went from we process here, we refine here, to we want to ship out raw bitumen as fast as possible. So this mania, and I think it's a patent, probably copyrighted by some public relations firm nonsense, of we must get bitumen to Tidewater. This is premised on a completely different, and I have to say, anti-Canadian economic theory. that what we want to do is rip and strip. We want to get out raw bitumen as fast as possible and ship it to other countries. Now, one of the first casualties of the Kinder Morgan existing pipeline, shifting its flow, and as you know, pipelines can carry more than one kind of product. They have barriers along the pipeline to keep one shipment can come through of Syncrude and then a shipment can come through of Dilbit. Bitumen that's solid and unprocessed can't move through a pipeline, so they have to stir in this diluent material, which is additionally hazardous, creates a product that you can't clean up. Bitumen mixed with diluent in a marine environment can't be cleaned up. It operates in the marine environment differently from crude. It's another aspect of the historical versus the current. But when Kinder Morgan first began shipping Dilbit, the National Energy Board said, okay, you can export that out. The result has been that Chevron has had to cut by 1/3 its workforce and cut by 1/3 its production. So the survival of our last remaining southern lower mainland refinery is very much in doubt if this project gets approved. Unifor, the union of the workers at Chevron's refinery, intervened in this process too to oppose the pipeline, saying what I just said. Approval of the Kinder Morgan expansion will cost jobs in Canada. So solution, I'd like to point to solutions. We've got to stop treating pipeline politics in Canada as regionally divisive. We really need to bring to bear all of our intelligence and all of our commitment to Canadian jobs and to a well-organized, sensible plan to move away from fossil fuels. Bring those together. And what that will, I believe the solution is in support for a refinery in Northern Alberta, so bitumen can be processed in Northern Alberta. We will no longer have debates about pipelines, whether Energy East or Keystone or Enbridge or Kinder Morgan. They've all been committed to this notion that is, I'm afraid to say, very rarely examined, that it's a benefit to Canada to ship out unprocessed raw bitumen. I support every single word you heard from this podium earlier. The mayors of my community, I represent Saanich and the Gulf Islands. The Salish Sea is critical to my riding, my constituents, and the 4 First Nations that live in my riding. I raise my hands to the Coast Salish people, whom I have the honor to represent and also work with them on a nation-to-nation basis. Haishka, we will not allow this pipeline to proceed. And I'm open to any questions you may have about the process.
What can you do to stop it?
I'm going to court.
Do you think Justin wants to approve it? Dan wants to approve it?
I don't know. I don't have any way of knowing. I haven't asked him about it. But it seems, what's that?
There's a lot of tea leaves to read
Yes.
with this government over the last 7 months.
There is no question that approving pipelines is inconsistent with our Paris commitments. Because and let me give you some evidence to go with that statement. When the final environmental assessment on Keystone was presented to Secretary of State John Kerry, I read that too. Now, it was presented as though the environmental assessment was a approval that Keystone would not cause damage to the environment. It was certainly read that way by Joe Oliver at the time, our former Minister of Natural Resources. But what that report actually said was, as long as the price of a barrel of oil is above $80 a barrel, then building additional pipelines will not, in and of itself, promote expansion of the oil sands and thus a higher rates of emissions of greenhouse gases. So a low barrel of oil price globally, which is where we are now, with a low price for oil, any new pipelines are pressure for expansion of the oil sands. Our solution as a country is to avoid expanding the oil sands, but to continue levels of production that create more jobs, that are more sustainable, that are for more domestic use, which would mean processing in Alberta product that Canadians can use, as opposed to exporting it as fast as possible while Eastern Canada imports oil. And lest you've fallen for the propaganda about Energy East, that somehow this will be getting Alberta oil to refineries in Eastern Canada, by far the majority of the product to be shipped to Eastern Canada by Energy East project is for export as raw bitumen to go to other countries to create jobs in other refineries that may not have our standards of environmental regulation around emissions and so on.
How much pressure do you think the Trudeau cabinet is under by Alberta to approve a pipeline?
They're under huge pressure because the issue is misunderstood. If we could recognize that this is not a zero-sum game, a win for Alberta, a lose for BC. If we could reanalyze this issue and say, if we have an energy policy for Canada, one of the things we'd want in an energy policy surely would be creating more jobs for Canadians from the resource. Surely would be energy security so that half of the country isn't dependent on imports from other places. If we had an energy strategy combined with a climate strategy, we wouldn't have this notion of geographical and regional division. We can find a solution that works for everyone here if we stop putting the interests of multinational fossil fuel industries and companies above those of the Canadian economy.
The direct message from Alberta for months, and especially with the downturn of the economy, is that we need a pipeline. So, I mean, all of this is interesting, but how much pressure do you think?
Let's
So an Alberta government that has abandoned its call for upgraders. The NDP in Alberta used to favor upgraders, favor
I know.
refining what you're saying. Now
Well,
they no longer.
Premier Notley still has promoted one upgrader that wouldn't have been there until after her election. I think it's important in many of these, and I've been through many consultations, multi-stakeholder processes. I've been in, when we used to in Canada, before C-38 also killed the National Roundtable on Environment Economy, there's an importance to listening to each other. And when you listen to each other, even if the words are Alberta needs a pipeline, maybe what the real value below that is Alberta needs a strong economy. So if there's another way to provide a stronger economy, and bear in mind, I'm not alone in saying these things. The unions that represent the workers of the oil sands, Unifor, the largest union representing refinery workers and oil sands workers, intervened in this process, just as I did, to say no to this project. Because the first casualty of Kinder Morgan being approved will be the jobs at the Chevron refinery, because the Chevron refinery in Burnaby will close because it will not be able to access a product it can use in its refinery, because no refinery in Canada currently can use bitumen and diluent. They can't process it.
Can you explain how and when and why you'll be going to court?
Oh, I am currently interviewing lawyers. I entered into this process as an intervener, and when the National Energy Board made their ruling that interveners would not be allowed to cross-examine witnesses, I filed a motion of protest. The NEB ruled against me. I've put the NEB on notice. Now I think it's 2 years at least that I've put the NEB on notice that if they did not allow basic rules of procedural fairness, I would be seeking a judicial review of the entire process. I appeared before the National Energy Board and provided a 40-minute final argument earlier this year, and again put them on notice that and I did outline in detail the evidence that was accepted by the National Energy Board, even though it was falsified, the failure to allow any testing of any of the evidence. I'll just give you a snapshot of this. Key issue for us who live on the Salish Sea is, do you have the capacity to clean up a spill? And bitumen and diluent together have never been spilled in the marine environment because we haven't shipped that much yet. We don't have experience with bitumen and diluent in the marine environment. We do have experience with it in a freshwater environment when there was an Enbridge pipeline break and they pumped thousands of barrels of bitumen and diluent into the Kalamazoo River in Michigan. That's how we found out that it is impossible to clean up bitumen and diluent in a freshwater environment. So Kinder Morgan's entire case that bitumen and diluent will behave in the marine environment just like crude is based on a one-time only 10-day study that they did in a tank in Gainford, Alberta. They filled a tank with water, they stirred in salt, and then they said when you move it around, it's just like the Burrard Inlet. Only the temperatures went way above what they were supposed to because it was really hot in Alberta when they did their one-time 10-day study. It got to the water in the tank was way above anything you'd ever find in the marine environment. The tank with salt with fresh water was nothing like the ocean. Meanwhile, DFO has done studies, and the Royal Society of Canada has done studies. But even though Kinder Morgan said to the National Energy Board at one point in their arguments, many more studies are being done than their inadequate one-time only 10-day study in Gainford, Alberta, where the researchers who did the project were never made available for any of us to ask them questions. Wouldn't you think it would have been better to do this a few times to see? This is a really large project to hinge on a one-time only joke of a study in a tank, and they had another one in a plastic bucket. where they lacked a ruler big enough to measure the way the spill moved around in the plastic bucket. I'm not kidding you. They get away with bloody murder when they provide 23,000 pages and hope no one reads it. That's the whole reason they provide 23,000 pages, is hoping no one will go through it and it will impress us by its sheer weight. So,
Clarify, though, are you
Yeah.
taking the NEB to court no matter what the final outcome of
The
cabinet
national-
decision is?
I think in terms of my statute of limitations, and I had originally, my first lawyer on this file was Clayton Ruby. I'm still talking to Clayton Ruby. I'm also talking to some lawyers in Vancouver. Given statute of limitations, and I have to refresh my memory on exactly what that is, I don't think I have the liberty to wait and see what happens in December to file for judicial review soon. So I am working on that. I'll update you when I know who my lawyer is going to be, how I'm going to proceed. But the violation of procedural fairness and the lack of any evidentiary rigor to what was presented. Oh, I was going to mention the Royal Society of Canada. The Kinder Morgan lawyers had the gall to say to the NEB, don't worry, more evidence is coming soon from the Royal Society of Canada. When they saw what our scientific academy made of this question of how bitumen and diluent behave in the marine environment, they objected to the Royal Society of Canada report being accepted into evidence before the NEB because it didn't corroborate their joke of a 10-day study in Gameford, Alberta. This process, I mean, when I say scam and sham, there are reasons that strong interveners pulled out. Many pulled out, including economist Robin Allen, a number of First Nations, a lot of NGOs pulled out because they thought this process is a fraud. And I don't say that lightly about the national.
Fixed.
I mean, the process is broken. The process remains broken. This add-on is inadequate. You can't fix a process this broken with an add-on. So the difficulty here is that until the Environmental Assessment Act is fixed and it remains broken, we're still operating under what Stephen Harper did to environmental assessment under C-38. Nothing has changed. So the process is so badly flawed that, and in so many different ways, that it's hard for me to adequately even hint at them in the time we have this morning. Thank you very much.